Hello, hello! Welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains not living up to such obvious potential. And today, we are going to discuss planes that wound up in that exact situation. For one reason or another, these aircraft never got to shine in the way they really should have been able to. These are 5 amazing planes that never had a chance. The McDonnell Douglas X-36. Sometimes called the Boeing X-36, as McDonnell Douglas merged with Boeing while the project was going on, but regardless, these 2 aircraft were known as the Tailless Fighter Agility Research Aircrafts. It was a stealthy, subscale prototype jet that was meant to fly without the traditional empennage found on most aircraft, namely the tail. It didn't have one. Kind of like a flying wing in that regard, but unlike a flying wing, it had a normal fuselage. The idea was to reduce weight, drag, as well as the radar cross-section, increasing stealth performance. The only versions of this craft that were built were 2 28% scale versions that were controlled by pilots on the ground in a virtual cockpit. The reason for this is that, frankly, they just weren't sure if the tailless idea was going to go well, and they were afraid of putting an actual pilot inside of one without testing exactly what kind of aerodynamic issues this tailless setup would run into beforehand. There was a lot of unknowns involved in the design, but apparently it did extremely well. Though it was unstable in both pitch and yaw axis, it had an advanced digital fly-by-wire control system that gave it the extra stability it needed. It also utilized thrust vectoring, doing what a tail normally would do in terms of that, and it first flew on the 17th of May 1997, making 31 successful research flights. The handling was exceptional, and the program apparently exceeded all goals. It was incredibly maneuverable, ideal for use as a fighter, but it was never developed into one. Nothing came of it in terms of anything that we're currently aware of. A full-scale version was never built, and both the prototypes were put into museums. One is at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, and the other is outside of Air Force Test Flight Center Museum at Edwards Air Force Base in California. As far as why it was never developed into anything else, it's possible they just didn't need it. The technology was interesting, but there were a lot of unknowns, and it was likely to be very expensive. That being said, I do wonder if the X-36's development and data was put into the development of a different type of airframe, the Boeing X-45. This is an unmanned combat air vehicle. It's a drone, so it's possible that at least some of the X-36's data went into the X-45. Yes, Boeing is working on a drone that is designed to carry missiles. You know, this combined with the 737 MAX debacle makes me seriously wonder if Boeing's trying to kill us all. But that's a different topic entirely. The Sukhoi Su-47 Berkut, NATO reporting name Firkin. This is a one-of-a-kind experimental aircraft turned technology demonstrator. Development on this plane started as far back as 1983. And if you notice, it's got a lot of interesting features. The fuselage itself looked pretty similar to a lot of other Sukhoi planes, and that makes sense given a lot of its components actually came from the Su-27 family. But the 47 has a lot of differences, and the biggest one I think is obvious. What is up with those wings? They're forward swept. Why would you want to do that? Well, tests on forward swept wings have shown incredible performance in terms of maneuverability. The Su-47's agility at subsonic speeds is ludicrous, making its dogfighting potential absolutely out of this world, better than some 5th-gen fighters. Those forward swept wings give it a lot of unique characteristics. Higher lift-to-drag ratio, better agility, like I said, higher range at subsonic speeds, improved stall resistance as well as anti-spin characteristics, improved stability at high angles of attack, a lower minimum flight speed, and a shorter takeoff and landing distance. The problem with forward swept wings and this is why the Berkut remains pretty unique, is that the forward swept wings create a lot of stresses under load, namely wing twisting, which sounds as bad as it is. This means the wings have to be made of incredibly strong material, and they must be designed to twist as they bend, opposite to the geometric twisting they deal with. In the Berkut's case, it actually worked out pretty well. It also has thrust vectoring and those forward canards to add to its already unique appearance. But like I said, it's only a technology demonstrator and was never developed as a full-tilt production plane, despite the fact it was initially proposed as such. Why not? Well, that has to do with the fall of the Soviet Union more than anything else. Like I said, the Berkut's development started in '83, and it was actually initially proposed as the Su-37 in the early '90s. But when the wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved, the budget for military hardware, especially very ambitious and futuristic military hardware, just didn't exist in Russia at that time. By the time they actually got to a point of possibly investing funds to make a production version of the Berkut, it just didn't seem necessary. Sukhoi had already pushed forward and developed the Su-35, as well as the 5th generation fighter, the Su-57. Those planes were already doing what the Berkut could do, with maybe less maneuverability, but still, investing more money in the Berkut just didn't seem reasonable. They still have it, it's still around, and it has gotten significant use as a technology demonstrator. As a platform, it tests various ideas that get put into planes like the Su-57. So in that way, the Berkut was still able to contribute to the overall progress of aviation military hardware. And that's a lot better than most experimental aircraft. The British Aircraft Corporation TSR-2. This is actually the first of 2 entries on this video that are beasts of a topic involving some general political mismanagement and possible arguments regarding roles and need and money and things like that. So I'm going to try to simplify this as much as I can, but like I said, this is a simplified version of this aircraft's story. This plane was a Cold War strike and reconnaissance aircraft that was meant for the Royal Air Force, developed in the late 50s and the early 60s. It was designed around the idea of using both conventional as well as nuclear weapons delivery systems. It was thought that it could penetrate well-defended front-line areas at low altitudes and very high speeds, and then attack high-value targets in rear areas. The platform was also considered for a possible role as a high-altitude, high-speed standoff side-looking radar and photographic imagery and signals intelligence aerial reconnaissance system. Though 3 were built, only one of them ever flew, and it never made it to production. What the heck happened with this thing? It looks pretty cool, a solid plane for that era. It was conceived in response to the development of surface-to-air missiles. High-altitude, slow bombers were not going to be able to deal with SAMs at all, but a low-altitude, fast, precision-strike aircraft might be able to get away with this. But designing a craft with the requirements they asked for was no easy feat. The requirement included delivery of tactical nuclear weapons at low level in all weather, day or night, photo reconnaissance at medium level in the day and low level, day and night, electronic reconnaissance in all weather, delivery of tactical nuclear weapons day and night at medium altitudes using blind bombing if necessary, and delivery of conventional bombs and rockets. Oh right, it had to be supersonic, and it should probably be short takeoff and landing, or possibly even vertical takeoff and landing. Go nuts, guys! Just put everything into this plane! But political factors really screwed up development even before the final design was really settled upon. Defense Minister Duncan Sandys stated in a 1957 defense white paper that the era of manned combat was at an end, and ballistic missiles were the weapons of the future. Now, people have been saying that for decades, and we still have manned aircraft in the air. But this caused a whole storm of whether or not they even needed another plane. There was also arguments between the various services. The Royal Navy was in the middle of another project, the NA.39, which would become the Blackburn Buccaneer. It was thought the Buccaneer would be more cost-effective and be able to do what the TSR-2 could also do in theory. But the RAF disputed this, as they found the Buccaneer unsuitable due to poor takeoff performance and the avionics not being capable of what they wanted. A lot of submissions were thrown out there, and eventually it kind of evolved into a mishmash of a lot of them. The TSR-2 would be built by Vickers Armstrongs working with English Electric. Yeah, that English Electric. Like the Deltic English Electric. Go figure. Naturally, there were cost overruns as well as communication errors between the complicated nature of developing this thing. In fact, the overall cost would wind up being, at that point, the largest aircraft project in Britain. There were the usual hijinks and vibration issues that sometimes plague prototypes, but the people involved said that there wasn't any doubt that the airframe would be able to accomplish the goals that was set for it. Even though it was expensive, it would be able to do what the RAF wanted, once the typical growing pains of developing an all-new aircraft were worked out. But by the 1960s, the US military was developing the swing-wing F-111, which was designed to do something rather similar to what the TSR-2 was supposed to do. There was some interest from Australia possibly wanting the TSR-2, but in 1963 they chose to buy the F-111 instead, as they were offered a better price and delivery schedule, which is really funny, because by the time the F-111 was ready to enter service, it had been another 10 years, and the cost had tripled, so that was cool. The RAF was also asked to consider the F-111 at the time, as it was thought it might be much cheaper than developing the TSR-2. BAC employees actually held a protest march when the subject of possibly canceling the program was brought up, and the new Labour government issued strong denials. But at 2 cabinet meetings held on the 1st of April 1965, it was decided to cancel the program, on the grounds of projected costs, and instead get an option agreement to acquire up to 110 F-111 aircraft, with no immediate commitment to necessarily buy them in the end. When the project was cancelled, all airframes were ordered to be destroyed and burned, which seems really extreme. You guys need to chill out over there. But finding a replacement for the TSR-2 didn't go so well. The F-111 project was not a smooth process at all, if I'm being honest with you. It was way more expensive than anybody thought it would be, and that combined with the devaluation of the British pound meant that purchasing F-111s wound up being way more expensive than the TSR-2 ever would have been. The RAF wound up canceling their order for 50 F-111Ks in January of 1968. Instead, they wound up with F-4 Phantom IIs and the Blackburn Buccaneer. Both planes wound up turning out really well for the RAF, particularly the Buccaneer, who, like I said, they initially cast aside, believing it not to be suitable for their needs. But it still makes you wonder, how would the TSR-2 have gone had politics not gotten in the way? 2 airframes actually managed to survive. The complete XR-220 is at the RAF Museum, Cosford, and the XR-222 is at the Imperial War Museum, Duxford. So, at least that's something. The Northrop / McDonnell Douglas YF-23. Oh boy, this is a hard one to talk about. See, the F-22 is my favorite jet ever, by a considerable margin. And the reason the YF-23 didn't wind up being put into production is that it was competing with the 22. And that's really awkward for me, because, to be fair, the 23 was a really, really good plane, and could have been something really cool had it actually won the competition. And let's be completely fair about this. Sometimes when military services hold manufacturer competitions to decide which new cool thing to go with, both options are good. It's not always a case of, well, this one's obviously better and the other is crap. In this situation especially, both choices were totally reasonable. The 23 and 22 were meant to fill a very specific role with very specific requirements, and both could do that. 2 prototypes of the 23 were built, nicknamed Black Widow 2, as well as Grey Ghost. And the design was initially submitted for the US Air Force's Advanced Tactical Fighter program. The ATF aircraft was supposed to be for an air-to-air combat role. It was meant to take advantage of emerging technologies, composite materials, lightweight alloys, advanced flight control systems, more powerful propulsion systems, as well as stealth technology. The 23 nailed down the major requirements: survivability, supercruise, stealth, as well as easy maintenance, which is funny, because a lot of modern aircraft aren't easy to maintain. And the 23 wound up with a really radical and very futuristic design. Looks like it's straight out of a sci-fi movie. There were a lot of hurdles that would need to be overcome for the production version, and perhaps for some of the military brass, it just seemed too futuristic. The 22 was a lot more familiar, and it did have a pretty big advantage over the 23. The 23 was stealthier and faster than the 22. It had that, but it was less agile. The 22 was more maneuverable, so in a dogfight situation, it had a significant advantage. Not that either was ever meant to be in that situation, but if it did happen, the 22 would win. And it was simply lower risk, still expensive and ambitious, but not as much as the 23 would have been. Northrop Grumman later would not actually give up on the 23 though. In 2004 they proposed a bomber based on the design, though it was eventually rejected, as the Air Force favored a bomber with much greater range than the 23 would ever be capable of with its size. For what it's worth, both prototypes did survive into preservation. One is at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, and one is at the Western Museum of Flight at Zamperini Field, Torrance, California. The Avro Canada CF-105 Aero. Oh no! I knew I would have to talk about this eventually, but the Aero is like the pinnacle of unseen potential. There were very few connoisseurs of military aviation history that aren't familiar, at least somewhat, with the Aero and her sad, horrible story, where a really, really good plane was completely chucked out the window. And why? Why do you ask? Politics. You probably already figured out that this design is a product of the most legendary warrior nation on the planet, Canada. Avro was a really good company, developing a lot of really cool tech, and the Aero wound up being one of those things. The plane was promised to possibly reach Mach 2 speeds at altitudes exceeding 50,000 feet, 15,000 meters, and it was meant to serve as the Royal Canadian Air Force's primary interceptor into the 60s and beyond. They featured an interesting delta wing design, bold for that time, but the initial testing went really well. I mean really well. It achieved Mach 1.9, which wasn't even at the limits of what it could potentially do. The Aero was set to be one of the best, if not the best, interceptors of its day, and they might actually still be in service now, in updated form, if they had been put into production. But they weren't, because politics. In 1953, senior Canadian military officials at the Chiefs of Staffs began to question the program entirely. The chiefs of both the Army and the Navy were strongly opposed to the Aero because substantial funds were being diverted to the Air Force, and they wanted that money for their stuff. Yeah, they want to do stuff too. Air Marshal Hugh Campbell, RCAF Chief of Staff, defended the program right up until it was cancelled, to his credit. But in June of 1957, the governing Liberal Party lost the federal election to a progressive conservative government under John Diefenbaker. Diefenbaker had campaigned on a platform of reining in what the Conservatives claimed was rampant liberal spending, despite the fact of the project that, while expensive, was creating a bunch of jobs for people and helping economic development. In August of 1957, the Canadian government signed the NORAD, North American Air Defense Agreement, with the United States. That made Canada a partner with American command and control. This was a problem for the Aero, because the United States was able to offer a bunch of stuff, including the Bomark nuclear-tipped anti-aircraft missile for use in their own defense. This type of technology made the Aero seem a little more unnecessary. At the time, defense against ballistic missiles was becoming a major priority, and it was believed that Canada could afford the Aero or the Bomark missile, along with an automated air defense system called SAGE, but not both of those things. The Minister of National Defense, George Pierce, requested the cancellation of the Aero in August of 1958, but the Cabinet Defense Committee, CDC, absolutely refused to do this. Pierce backed down for the moment, and at the same time recommended the installation of the Bomark system, which was accepted, but when he asked about the Aero again, the CDC again refused to cancel it, because they really wanted their plane. Okay, it was a nice plane. They wanted to wait until a major review was to happen on the 31st of March 1959. While this was going on, they tried selling the Aero to other countries, seeing if anyone else might be interested, particularly the United States and Britain. Britain was already in the middle of several aircraft programs, and didn't have the funds to invest in buying something that wasn't ready yet. Here in the US, okay look, the last thing we want to do ever is buy someone else's technology. We will spend all the money in the universe making our own. We will not buy yours, under any circumstances, unless it's the Harrier. We really decided we wanted those. Outside of that though, we don't want it. We sell other people our stuff. We don't buy your stuff. Ridiculous. So yeah, we didn't want them either. The cancellation was announced on the 20th of February 1959. The day became known as Black Friday in the Canadian aviation industry. Diefenbaker claimed it was based on a thorough examination of threats and defensive measures, as well as cost. But this was not without significant negative effects for Canada in general. For one thing, in addition to the missiles, they also bought some of America's McDonnell F-101 Voodoo planes, which were good, but didn't necessarily have the potential the Avro seemed to. Also, and this is a major thing, the decision immediately put nearly 15,000 Avro employees out of work, and another 15,000 in the supply chain were also out of work. 30,000 people lost their jobs because they canceled one plane. Avro management was completely unprepared by the suddenness of the cancellation. They attempted to provide the completed Avros to the National Research Council of Canada as a high-speed test aircraft, but they refused, noting that without sufficient spare parts and maintenance, as well as qualified pilots, they wouldn't have any use for them. It seemed the entire project was cursed from the start. No matter how good it was, no one was giving it a chance, except for the people responsible for designing it in the first place. Avro and the people that worked with this plane were the only ones at the time that loved it, and knew what it could be. The governments around it, though, weren't having it. Within 2 months of the cancellation, all aircraft, engines, and production tooling and technical data were supposed to be scrapped. The reason given was that they wanted to destroy classified and secret materials used to build the plane. And later it was discovered that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police believed that a Soviet mole had infiltrated Avro, which actually was confirmed later to be somewhat true in a way. Rumors circulate that Air Marshal W.A. Curtis, who was a World War I ace, had actually ignored Diefenbaker. Good. And spirited away one of the Avros to save for posterity later. Those rumors were given life in a 1968 interview. When he was asked directly if that rumor was true, he simply said, "I don't want to answer that," which is really sus, by the way. But to date, people still reel from the Avro's loss. In retrospect, it's one of aviation technology's greatest injustices. Not just for the plane, but for the people that worked on it. 30,000 people out of work because you didn't want to fund one plane that showed remarkable potential. It was a ridiculous decision. Its loss led to the end of Avro Aircraft Limited, and the only surviving remains of this plane involve a nose cone section of Avro Aero RL-206 that's currently on display at the Canada Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa, which was only saved because it was smuggled out of the plant at Malton by members of the RCAF Flying Personnel Medical Establishment. It looks like prototype number 3's wing outer panels survived as well. Some replicas have also been put together, and in 2012 a new version of the Avro was proposed as an alternative to the Canadian purchase of F-35 aircraft. Long and short of that, you bought our F-35s. You did it. You absolutely bought our F-35s. Of course you did that. Of course you did that. Look at them. How could you say no? It costs so much of our money. Please buy some. We have to make up some of all the trillions we put into this nonsense. And in one final bit of justice to a certain degree, those plans for the Avro that were supposed to be destroyed, yeah, they weren't. On January 6, 2020, CBC News announced that the plans were actually kept. Ken Barnes, a senior draftsman on the project, was ordered to destroy them. Instead, he just took them home, where he stored them for decades. And you know what? More power to that guy. It's a shame what happened to the Avro. Absolutely disgusting, if you ask me. And I've talked about a lot of things in history that never got a chance to shine, whether it be trains or planes, but the Avro in particular, man, she and Avro deserved better. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders: Thomas Ward, Sumdu267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitson 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, DM Tribal Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Ohio Trucker 1, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Alaric Jaspers, Bry Dagger 8, Twin Fox, and Jack Carson's Railroad Videos. Until next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.